Well, welcome to Meck's online campus. I once heard of a little girl who was drawing a picture at school, and her teacher came over and asked her what she was drawing. And the little girl said, "Well, I'm drawing a picture of God." And the teacher said, "Well, honey, you know, nobody really knows what God looks like." And the little girl didn't even pause. She said, "Well, they will when I get done." Last week, we started a 3-week series on worship, a word that comes from an old Anglo-Saxon word that literally reads worthship. And that's the idea of worship, giving worth or honor to someone or something, which you can obviously give to anyone or anything. And most of the time, we do distribute it pretty widely. We engage in small W worship, like giving worth to a favorite football team or maybe a musical artist. Capital W worship is much more spiritual in nature and obviously involves the worship of God. Last week, we talked about what that does to us and for us, how life-changing and revitalizing and powerful a worshiping life can be. So why don't more people do it? Why aren't there more authentic worshipers of God? I think the main reason is that we don't really understand who it is we're talking about, who it is that we're worshiping. We've never had anyone draw us a picture of God, at least not of the real thing, not something that would stimulate us or want us to worship. Because if we had that picture, we couldn't help but respond in worship. And that's what I want to try and do today. I want to try to get a picture of God in our hearts and in our minds that will draw us to want to be worshipers of Him, or at least make the object of our worship more clear and compelling. And I want to get at that picture by taking a look at one of the most remarkable scenes recorded in all of Scripture. It's a time when the prophet Isaiah had this direct encounter with the living God. And let me just tip my hat to the insights of R.C. Sproul, who first opened my eyes many years ago to the many intricacies of this passage. So let's jump in. Here's how it begins. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord. Okay, let's stop there. King Uzziah was one of the great kings in terms of length of term. He led Israel for 52 years. He was victorious during that time in battle over the Philistines, and he built towers in Jerusalem and he strengthened the city walls, and he dug these massive cisterns in the desert. He restored the military power of Judah. He led for 52 years. Think about that. The average person living at that time never knew of any other leader. In my lifetime, there have been 12 different presidents, beginning with John F. Kennedy, who became president the year I was born, to now President Biden. But people living during this time in Jerusalem, there had only been Uzziah. Years after year, decade after decade, one leader their entire lifetime. Then he died. So Isaiah enters the temple during this time of national mourning, maybe trying to collect himself or get his head around the fact that they were now leaderless and what that meant for the people. And he was at a time where he was dealing with a lot of emotions, probably, with the death of Uzziah. What happens? Well, in the year that King Uzziah died, he said, I saw the Lord. I saw the King of Kings, the ultimate King. So right at the start, everything's put into perspective for Isaiah. Well, let's keep reading. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord, high and exalted, seated on a throne, and the train of his robe filled the temple. Above him were seraphim, each with 6 wings. With 2 wings they covered their faces, with 2 they covered their feet, and with 2 they were flying. Okay, let's stop there. We already have this amazing scene to digest. Here was the Lord, high on a throne, the train of his robe, filling the entire temple, surrounded by angels. And the seraphim with 6 wings. And they only used 2 of those for flying. 2 were used to cover their faces. What was up with that? Well, the reason is because they couldn't look on God's face. It was too much for them. And that's mind-boggling to think about, because these were the mighty seraphim. The word seraph means the burning ones, the bright ones. And yet the fire and brightness of the glory of God was beyond even their ability to engage. Earlier in the Old Testament, when the famed Jewish leader Moses asked to see God's face, God told him, no one can see my face and live. And so God only allowed him to catch a passing glimpse of the back of him as he went by. But even from that, His face and body was so changed, so radiating and shining and pulsating with energy that the people who saw him afterward ran away in sheer terror. And the terror came from seeing a man who reflected the glory of the back of God. If people couldn't bear the view of someone who reflected the glory of the backside of God, no wonder no one could stand to see his face. By the way, one fun little footnote. One of the amazing things awaiting those of us who are Christ followers is how in heaven we are told that then we will finally be able to look on the face of God and not only live, but to see him as he is. Well, that's not all. Along with 2 wings for flying and 2 with wings that they were covering their faces, we're told that 2 wings were covering their feet. That's also significant. Going back again to the life of Moses, if you're familiar at all with his story, you may remember that at the moment he first encountered God at this scene of a burning bush that burned but didn't burn up, he was told to remove his sandals. Why? Because he was standing on holy ground in the presence of the living God. Throughout history and culture, our feet have represented our earthiness, our creatureliness. And the angels were acknowledging this aspect of their being in the presence of God by covering their feet, acknowledging that they, the created, were in the presence of the Creator. But they weren't just flying around the throne. They were saying something to each other about this God. Let's keep reading. And they were calling to one another, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord Almighty. The whole earth is full of his glory." At the sound of their voices, the doorposts and the thresholds shook, and the temple was filled with smoke. In the Hebrew language, and the Old Testament of the Bible was written in Hebrew, when a word was repeated, it wasn't just for poetic style and impression. It was a device used for saying something highly significant. Repetition indicated importance. So in English, we might use an exclamation point when we're writing, or we might underline something, or we might raise our voice to try to get across a point. In Hebrew, they simply repeated themselves. So Jesus would say something like, "Truly, truly, I say to you," meaning this is some pretty significant truth. So when something was repeated twice, it was very significant what was being said. A point was being emphasized. So there's one scene in the Old Testament that's kind of fun, where in Hebrew it says that these men fell into a pit. But in the Hebrew it says they didn't just fall into a pit. It says they fell into a pit, meaning it was a heck of a pit that they fell into. So you can imagine when something was repeated not once, not twice, but 3 times, the strongest possible point was being made. And there's only one time in the Bible that a single attribute of God is mentioned 3 straight times, not once, not twice, but 3 times. And here it is in Isaiah's encounter with God and the words of the angels about that God. The Bible says God is holy, holy, holy. It was all the angels could say. The Bible never says that God is love, 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 or mercy, 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 though he is both of those things. But when it came to what was really trying to get across about God's nature and identity, character, holy, holy, holy. That when we come to God, there should be this sense of awe, sense of wonder, sense that we've entered into the presence of that which is not like us. Such an awe-inspiring presence that the entire temple was shaking. You know, we tend to think of holiness as goodness, moral purity, being without sin. That's obviously a part of it. But the deeper meaning of holy is that which is set apart, separate, wholly, completely, entirely different, completely other. When Isaiah came into the presence of God, he experienced what the angels experienced, this awe, this wonder, this spellbinding sense of that which is not us, that which is other. It was this part of God that made Isaiah fall on his knees. And I think we would have too. At first, out of sheer terror. I mean, our senses overwhelmed by the transcendent. Because isn't that the heart of what terrifies us about the supernatural, its entire otherness, but also what attracts us to it? It's kind of an odd combination, isn't it? That attraction and fear. But I was born in Chicago and raised out west, though, in places like California and Utah and Washington. And I recall as a young boy, we would take these long drives through the desert, often at night. And I would be sitting in the back seat of the family car, all the time sprawled out on the floor, because back then you didn't have to have car seats or seat belts. And sprawled out for these long drives across these vast expanses of the western desert late at night. And I remember my parents would often turn on the radio, and there was a show that they would listen to called CBS Radio Mystery Theater. And it was hosted by a guy named E.G. Marshall. You ought to Google it. It's some fun stuff. But there was these memories of that unsettling entrance into the world of the supernatural through the theater of the mind remains with me to this day. I loved it. Sproul mentions how earlier generations tuned into the radio show The Inner Sanctum, which ran from 1941 to 1952. Let me give you a taste of how that radio show would open up.
Boris Karloff on Inner Sanctum Mystery, brought to you by the makers of Carter's Pills.
Good evening, friends. Let me welcome you once more to the Inner Sanctum. This is Raymond, your host. Come in, won't you, and sit down? No, I'm not being polite. I'd prefer you to sit, you see, because within the next 5 minutes, you're going to be so weak in the knees that you won't be able to stand.
Okay, that officially scared people to death. But that's also why they tuned in. Sproul reminds us something of interesting. That Inner Sanctum, the name of that radio show, is Latin for within the holy. So while the holiness, the otherness of God might be terrifying, it is also what attracts us and spurs us on to worship. We don't want a small God. We don't want a God who is like us. That's not a God we would ever want to worship. We want a God who is not like us, a God high and exalted on his throne, surrounded by angels, causing the building to shake and fill with smoke. And that's the God that we have. So how did Isaiah react to all this? I mean, what was his response? Well, let's keep reading. Isaiah said, "Woe to me," I cried. "I am ruined, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips, and my eyes have seen the King, the Lord Almighty." What's the first, most natural response to God? I mean, if you're truly having a moment of encounter and worship? Well, Isaiah became overwhelmed with a deep and profound sense of his own personal sin. And this was from Isaiah. I mean, we're talking a prophet's prophet, a leader among leaders, a man of nobility, an elder statesman, one who dialogued regularly with kings and princes. Woe to me, which is what he said, is a phrase that's no longer in common use in our day, but in Isaiah's time, it held enormous significance. The root meaning of the word woe is to howl, such as to scream, like the scream of an infant or the cry of a jackal. It was used to express grief and despair, pain and contrition. It was one of two great prophetic declarations. When a prophet uttered a word that was meant to be positive, they would utter the word blessed, which is why during the Sermon on the Mount, for example, Jesus continually began each one of the sayings with the word blessed. Blessed is the one who mourns. Blessed is the one who hungers. Blessed is the one who thirsts. But when judgment was being uttered, a prophet would begin with the word woe, which is why in the New Testament, we find Jesus saying, "Woe to you, hypocrites." So here we see that when Isaiah the prophet encountered the living God, he said, "Woe to me." He howled in anguish at his condition before God. He uttered the prophetic judgment on himself. What divorced Isaiah from God was not his humanity in the face of divinity, but his moral bankruptcy in the face of holiness. And then he said something else. He said, "I am ruined." The word ruined literally means to become lost. Isaiah suddenly realized he had no footing on which to stand, no sense of where he was before God, no basis by which to exist. He stood precariously in his immorality before pure morality, knowing that there was absolutely 100% sufficient grounds to be cut off from life itself. One glimpse of God in his holiness, and he knew he had nothing to bring, nothing to offer, no basis for justification. no basis for acceptance. And if there was anyone who had it together, it was Isaiah. I mean, he was considered by his peers as the most righteous man of his generation. But once actually exposed to God, not as a concept, not as a theory, but as a man standing before the holy God, as God, Isaiah was brought face to face with the worth and honor and worship that was due this God. And he fell apart, made naked beneath the gaze of the absolute holiness of God, morally and spiritually just blown away. And he thought of himself as a man of integrity was annihilated. And it was because he had always compared himself to others, which is what we all do, right? When we're trying to get a sense of how we are and where we stand with God, and we always look at other people and we find other people. No, now he was standing alone in the presence of God. And that was the only comparison that mattered. And Isaiah's conviction was specific, saying that he was a man of unclean lips and he lived among a people of unclean lips. Does that strike you as odd? You might have expected him to confess any number of sins, actions and thoughts and habits and deeds. But what came to him at that moment was that he had a dirty mouth. For Isaiah, the moment of worship revealed to him the heart of his sinful nature. And for Isaiah, and I would say for most of us, it had to do with his tongue. And not in the way you might think. This wasn't about Isaiah saying, oh man, I swear too much. There's too much profanity coming out of my mouth, too many curse words. No, he was talking about something much, much deeper. For example, Jesus once said that it is out of the overflow of our heart that our mouths speak. In other words, it reveals what's in our heart. And there shouldn't be a discontinuity there. What Isaiah was talking about wasn't about coarse language as much as it was about the course of his life. Our mouths are dirty when we say we believe in God yet live far apart from him. Our mouths are dirty when we look around at others and say we're okay, yet when one look up to God, and that comparison would tell us we're not okay. See, that is the ultimate profanity. So at the very moment Isaiah understood who God was, he also understood who he was in relation to this God. But Isaiah didn't know he was going to be given even more reason to fall to his knees in worship of this God. Beyond the spectacle, beyond the encounter, beyond the awareness of all he was and in the face of all that God was, something else happened. Let me read it. Then one of the seraphim flew to me with a live coal in his hand, which he had taken with tongs from the altar. And with it he touched my mouth and said, see, this has touched your lips. Your guilt is taken away and your sin atoned for. Isaiah, in his broken, ruined, undone condition, experienced the healing touch of God's forgiveness. But this wasn't cheap grace. It wasn't cheap forgiveness. True grace and forgiveness never is. I think it's highly important to note that Isaiah's forgiveness, his purification, was represented by a burning coal upon his lips, the most sensitive, fragile part of the body, by a coal too hot for even the angel to touch with their hands. Purification is not easy. It can be painful. It would eventually, when it came to saving, purifying, and forgiving all of the human race who would take advantage of it, take a death on a cross. Well, if Isaiah wasn't ready to give his life in worship to this God before, and that, being this God being so worthy of it, now it was sealed, but it still wasn't over. This God on a throne, surrounded by angels, declaring his holiness, reaching out to the shaken, broken, overwhelmed man with radical grace and forgiveness, finally speaks. So have you noticed up until this point, God hasn't said a word. This is what we read next. Then I heard the voice of the Lord saying, whom shall I send? And who will go for us? And I said, here am I. Send me. And that is the pattern of a life that truly understands who God is and authentically worships him as that God. God makes himself known. We are struck with awe and terror and sheer otherness, and yet absolutely taken with him. God reaches out and forgives us and heals us in the midst of that, and then charges us, sends us. And Isaiah was only too ready to be that man. You notice he didn't say, here I am. No, he said, here am I. He didn't give his location. he gave his life over. Because he worshiped that kind of God, a God that you give your life to gladly, a God who, while striking the deepest sense of awe and wonder, causing us to hit our knees, is the God who reaches out as Father and lifts us to our feet in forgiveness. When we bow down in repentance and worship, we find ourselves lifted up in his arms as sons and daughters. If this isn't the God you worship, you probably aren't much of a worshiper. I mean, why would you be? But once you know this God, you can't help but give your life in worship. So who is your God? What picture have you been drawing of him? Is it this one? Is it one worthy of worship? Oh, it should be. And just to be clear, here is that picture again. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord, high and exalted, seated on a throne, and the train of his robe filled the temple. Above him were seraphim, each with 6 wings. With 2 wings they covered their faces, with 2 they covered their feet, and with 2 they were flying, and they were calling to one another, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord Almighty. The whole earth is full of his glory. At the sound of their voices, the doorposts and the threshold shook, and the temple was filled with smoke. Woe to me, I cried. I am ruined, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips, and my eyes have seen the King, the Lord Almighty. Then one of the seraphim flew to me with a live coal in his hand, which he had taken with tongs from the altar, and with it he touched my mouth and said, See, this has touched your lips. Your guilt is taken away, and your sin atoned for. Then I heard the voice of the Lord, saying, Whom shall I send? And who will go for us? And I said, Here am I. Send me.